Good evening. We'll go through some of the laws of counting the Omer. Next week, Mirza Hashem, we'll go through the laws of the morning of the Omer, the things we do because of the morning of the Omer, but this week we'll focus on the counting of the Omer. Okay, so when a person counts the Omer, so the counting of the Omer started on the second day of Pesach and continues. The last night that we count is the night before Shavuos. Interestingly enough, when you look in the Torah actually describes the counting not from Pesach until Shavuos. The Torah actually describes the counting as counting from the Omer Karban. The Omer was a sacrifice, was a meal offering that was brought on Pesach. And then it says you should count until for 49 days, for 7 weeks, until you get to the holiday where we bring the Karban Omer, the holiday when you bring the Shtei Halachem, the two breads that we bring on Shavuos. So therefore, the Torah itself does not actually describe this as a counting until Shavuos. It actually focuses on counting until the sacrifice which is brought on Shavuos. The idea of counting of Shavuos and counting because we're excited to get the Torah, that is something which is brought down by the commentaries, but is not necessarily said in the Torah itself. And it actually does make a difference because according to most opinions, the only biblical obligation to count is when you can count from the bringing of the Omer sacrifice until the bringing of the Shtei Halachem sacrifice. And because we don't have that today, because we don't have a Beis HaMikdash, therefore, according to many opinions, there is no biblical obligation to count the Omer today. It would only be a rabbinic obligation to count. When a person counts the Omer, so unlike other obligations of things that we have to say, so for example, like davening, so when a person davens, ideally a person really for all parts of davening should know what they're saying and should know should understand the words that they're saying. But with a few exceptions, technically for most of davening, for most of the prayers that we say every day, if a person does not understand what he's saying, he would still fulfill his obligation of davening. When it comes to the Omer is not like that. The point of the Omer, as we mentioned, is to count. And therefore, if a person is saying words, but they don't know what they're saying, so they're not counting. Right? Imagine a person was counting anything, was counting money, was counting objects, and he's just saying random words that he doesn't understand what he's saying in order to count. Even if it's a count in a certain language, he's counting in Chinese, but doesn't understand Chinese. He's counting in French, but doesn't understand French. So at the end of the day, he hasn't really counted anything because he doesn't know how many he has. The same thing when it comes to the Omer. If a person is going to go through the Omer and they're going to count all the different countings of the Omer, however, they don't understand what they are saying. So according to many opinions, they have not fulfilled their obligation. When you count, you have to know how many you count. So if we count day 5, day 6, day 7, if you know it's day 7, then you've counted day 7. If you don't know it's day 7, then even though you said the words, today is the 7th day of the Omer in Hebrew, if you don't know what you're saying, then according to many opinions, you have not fulfilled your obligation. So therefore, a person should either, when they count in Hebrew, understand what they're saying, or just maybe even more simply, they could just count in English. And they will fulfill their obligation that way as well. Okay. And the fact that the counting needs to be actually a counting, and it's not just obligation to say words, has other ramifications as well. For example, interesting question that's brought down. Let's say a person doesn't know what day of the Omer is. Is it the 5th day, the 6th day, the 7th day? He forgets what day of the Omer it is. So, today we can just look it up on the internet, look it up on our phones. But let's say a person, for whatever reason, couldn't do that. It's Shabbos, he doesn't have a phone, he's not with any other Jews, he has no idea what day the Omer is, he's trying to figure it out, he just can't remember. So a person may say, well, you know what? I'll count both days. If I don't know it's the 6th day or the 7th day, so I'll say both, and maybe that would work. But there are opinions that say that actually would not work. There are opinions that say that would not work because when you count, you need to know how many you have. And if you don't know how many you have, just to say, I have 6, I have 7, so you haven't counted 6, you haven't counted 7. So therefore, there are opinions that say because a count needs to be a real count. What we need to do here when we are counting the Omer is to count how many days have passed. Therefore, if a person does not know definitively what they are counting, so then they shouldn't count. At the end of the day, there are many opinions that say you would fulfill your obligation, even if you don't know which day it is and you just count both days. So therefore, if a person is in that such situation, that's what they should do. Perhaps they should not say a bracha because it is somewhat of a doubt. But the bottom line is a person has to realize that counting is not just saying words. Counting is really counting. And therefore, you have to know what you are saying. You have to know what day it is. You have to know what day you count. When a person counts, so in the Torah, it actually says you should count 50 days, which we understand to be you should count up to 50, meaning the last number we count is 49, but you count up to 50. The Torah also says you should count for 7 weeks. And therefore, when a person counts, they need to count both the days and the weeks. So for the first 6 days, they just say this is the first day of the Omer, second day of the Omer, so on and so forth. Once they get to the 7th day, they say today is the 7th day of the Omer, which is 1 week. On the 10th day, you would say this is the 10th day, which is 1 week and 3 days. We need to count both the days and the weeks because that's what the Torah tells us to do, to count both the days and the weeks. If a person only counted the days and he did not count the weeks, so then, according to many opinions, he would not fulfill his obligation, and that person should go ahead and count again. He should count again to make sure that he has fulfilled his obligation. But every night, it is important to count again, not only the days, but to count the days and the weeks as well. When does a person start counting? So ideally, a person should not count until Tzeis HaKochavim. And when I say ideally, that has to be understood what I mean by that. Again, ideally, according to some opinions, a person should wait until after Tzeis HaKochavim. This person should wait until after 3 stars have come out in order to count the Omer. However, a person should be very, very careful because sometimes if a person pushes it off and a person waits, then he will forget what night it is. Many of the obligations that we are required to do, our sages, our chachamim, so they put it with something else, so it's not an independent obligation, it's an obligation based on something else. And when it comes to Omer, so the ideal way to count is when you daven Mariv, then you should count the Omer at the same time that you are davening Mariv. And in this way, if you're accustomed to davening Mariv, then you will count the Omer when you count Mariv, when you daven Mariv as well. So much so that even if a person davened Mariv before Tzeis HaKochavim, even if a person davened Mariv before the stars came out, which a person could do as long as it's after sunset, and the truth is we could really daven before sunset as well, it's as long as it's after what we refer to as Plag HaMincha, which is earlier than sunset. But if a person, so before sunset, it's going to be too early to count the Omer. Right? We're going to make early Shabbos this week. And therefore we can daven Mariv even though it's before sunset, but it's too early to count the Omer. So, but after sunset, then a person could count the Omer. So even though we said earlier that person ideally should wait till the stars come out, however, if a person is davening Mariv, and the person is going to remember to count during Mariv, maybe they're going to remember later, maybe they'll forget later. Therefore, it is better to count when a person davens Mariv. Person does not daven Mariv, then obviously they don't have that problem. Or if they're davening by themselves without a minion, then they could just daven. They could wait till Tzeis HaKochavim to daven Marav and count then. If a person wants to kind of fulfill this ideal way of counting and to count after Tzeis HaKochavim, to count after the stars come out, so still we still are concerned that the person might forget, and therefore what the person should do is the following. They should count with everybody else when he's davening Marav, but he shouldn't say a bracha, he shouldn't say the blessing then, and then he should make the following stipulation, that if I remember to count later after Tzeis HaKochavim, after stars to come out, I don't want this to be my counting, I don't want this to be a valid counting. However, if I don't remember to count later, then I do want this to be a valid counting. And then if he remembers later, after Tzeis HaKochavim, after the stars come out, he'll count then, he'll count with a bracha, and he'll fulfill his obligation in the ideal way. But even if he doesn't remember later, he does still have this backup plan that he's already counted. If he doesn't remember to count later, so then he's already covered himself. He has already fulfilled his obligation. But again, because we want to be very careful that a person does not forget to count, therefore, if a person is davening Marav with a minyan, it's better to count with them. Even today, with all the technology that we have, and with all the apps and the reminders and the emails and all sorts of things to remind us to count, it's still sometimes a person does forget, and therefore a person should ideally count as soon as he could, and should count when he davens Marav. If he davens Marav before Shkia, before sunset, that's too early, and then the person should not count the Omer. He should wait till he is done. Also, another thing that Chazal did, another thing that our rabbis did to try to help us remember to count the Omer, is that a person is not allowed to eat, or at least not to have a full meal when it's time to count the Omer. So when it's time to count the Omer, before a person counts the Omer, a person should not eat. It's not specifically tied to the Omer. This is true by many different mitzvahs, many different things. With other things, it becomes a little more complicated. For example, we say on Purim night, which is right after Tanis Esther, a person's fasting, so they really shouldn't break their fast until after they hear the Megillah. Sometimes the person's not going to be able to hear the Megillah for many hours, and therefore it creates somewhat of a problem, especially because they've been fasting if they can't eat before they hear the Megillah. So if that comes up, you can come talk to me or ask your local rabbi what to do in that circumstance. When it comes to the Omer, it's a little easier, because as soon as you remember, counting the Omer is something you do by yourself. You don't need to hear it in shul. It's something that takes a couple seconds, and therefore a person could very easily just count when he remembers. So therefore, but this prohibition of eating before a person counts, again, is there to help a person have that extra reminder to count the Omer and not to forget. Okay. When a person counts the Omer, so even though we said that a person should wait till after the stars come out, but once the stars come out, then a person should count as soon as possible. And the reason for that is because the Torah says you should count 7 complete weeks. Sheva Shabbosos Tamimus Diena, which we understand to mean that when you count, and if we count every day, don't count a part of a day. You should count from the beginning of the day. You're counting at the beginning of the day that this coming day is day 3, day 5, day 7, whatever day it happens to be. If you count when the day is already half over, so you're only counting, since you're counting about the future, you're only counting, you're missing part of the day, so to speak. And therefore, ideally, a person should count as soon as nightfall comes, and this way they will fulfill what the pasuk is saying, what the verses told us, to count 7 complete weeks. Let's say, but if a person forgot to count, so then in the beginning of the night, they still could count later. How late could they count? So that's actually subject to a dispute, and this is a dispute which was never really resolved. It's a dispute in which we try to fulfill both opinions. So what's the dispute? One opinion says you can count the entire day. So if, for example, tonight is the 18th day of the Omer. Until sunset tomorrow, it's still the 18th day. And therefore, until sunset tomorrow, a person could still count the Omer. That's one opinion. The other opinion says no. If the pasuk says you have to count a complete day, okay, so we're not going to drive you crazy. You're not going to have to count the second that the day starts. You don't have to count the second that the day starts. But even though ideally you should count soon after nightfall as you could, but you don't have to count the second the day starts. However, once the night passed and it's already the day, that's already not considered a complete day, and it's too late to count. So again, we have these two opinions. One opinion is that you can count at any point. Ideally, you can count in the beginning of the night, but you can count until the next night, until sunset the next night. And the other opinion says that you can only count. You can only count until the morning. Once the morning comes, it's no longer considered that you've counted the complete day. And as we mentioned, this dispute has not really been resolved, and therefore we need to be careful for both opinions. So again, ideally, a person should count at night. But if they didn't, so when it comes to the next day, so now they're a little bit stuck. On the one hand, we have an opinion that says there's still an obligation to count, but we have another opinion that says there's not an obligation to count. And therefore, kind of the compromise that we make is, look, when it comes to just counting, so even though there's an opinion that says it's too late, okay, but if I count, I didn't do anything wrong by counting, even according to the opinion that says you missed out, it's too late to count. So you don't get a mitzvah. I don't get a mitzvah, but I'm not doing anything wrong by counting. And according to the other opinion, I'm obligated. So therefore, a person, even during the day, should go ahead and count the Omer. However, when it comes to making a bracha, making the blessing on the Omer, that a person should not do. Why should a person not do that? Why should a person not make a bracha? Why should a person not make a blessing? Because if there's an opinion that says that you shouldn't make a blessing, if there's an opinion that says you're not obligated to count, so the blessing that you're going to make is going to be a bracha levatala. The blessing that you're going to make is a invalid bracha. It's a bracha which is not necessary, and it's like saying Hashem's name in vain. And therefore, anytime we have a doubt, do we say a bracha? Do we not say a bracha? We don't go ahead and say a bracha. So the next day, a person should still count, but they shouldn't count with a bracha. We have a similar idea. We have a similar thing when it comes to, let's say a person forgot to count an entire day. A person is supposed to count all 49 days. Let's say a person missed a day and they didn't count an entire day. So are they still able to count? Are they still able to count? Have they missed out on the entire mitzvah, or they missed one day, but they could still do the mitzvah the next day? And here also we have a dispute. According to one opinion says, well, you have a mitzvah to count the Omer every night, and each night is an independent mitzvah. Each night is an independent obligation. So you missed day one, so you can still count the other 48 days. You missed any of the days, you can still count the other days. But the other opinion says no, that the mitzvah is to count all 49 days. We're obligated to count all 49 days. And if you missed one day, so then you haven't done what you're supposed to be doing. If you missed one day, then you have not, you're no longer able to fulfill the obligation. The obligation is to count all 49 days. And once you miss one day, then you missed out on the whole thing. So according to that opinion, once you missed a day, you would no longer count. So again, we have this dispute about, if you miss one day, have you missed out on the whole mitzvah of counting the Omer or not? And therefore, we make the similar compromise before. So if you miss one day, then you can't. You should still count the other nights, because maybe you still are obligated to count. However, when it comes to making a bracha, since there is an opinion that says you've missed out on the mitzvah and you're no longer able to do the mitzvah, therefore, when it comes to the other nights, count, because there's nothing wrong with counting, even if you're not obligated, but you can no longer say a bracha because maybe you're not obligated, and if you're not obligated, then you're not able to say you're not able to say a bracha. The bracha would be a bracha in vain. There is when we put these two things together, there is something interesting that comes out, because let's say a person on day 12, for example, forgot to count the Omer, but they remembered the next morning. So we said next morning you could still count, and you can count without a bracha. Right? You count on the next day, but you count without a bracha. Well, what about the next day? So one may have said that, well, day 13 I can't count with a bracha, because maybe the entire counting is one big mitzvah, and if you miss a day, then you can no longer count the other days. And maybe I missed day 12. You're right, I counted the morning of day 12, but there's an opinion that says I didn't fulfill my obligation with that. So if there's an opinion that says you haven't fulfilled your obligation by counting in the morning, and there's an opinion that says that once you miss a day, you've now missed the whole thing, you can no longer continue to count, so maybe I should not be able to count with the bracha. However, there the Shulchan Aruch says that we apply a concept known as a sveka, that we have a doubt within a doubt. That since maybe I really did fulfill my mitzvah on day 12, because maybe you are allowed to count during the day. And even if I didn't fulfill my mitzvah on day 12, well, maybe the fact that I didn't fulfill my mitzvah on day 12 is irrelevant to day 13, 14, 15, to the other days. And because it's a doubt within a doubt, therefore the halacha is that if a person missed a day, but they missed a night, but they counted the next day, then they can continue to count all the other days with a bracha. Similar concept, let's say a person's not sure if he missed a day or not. He's not sure, did I count day 12 or not? I have no recollection. I'm not sure if I did, I didn't, I don't remember. I think I might have, I'm not sure. So we apply the similar logic, that when it comes to day 13, we make the following argument, and we say, well, maybe you counted on day 12. Even if you didn't count on day 12, well, maybe that's irrelevant to day 13. So since, again, we have a doubt within a doubt, I don't know if I counted on day 12. And even if I did not count on day 12, maybe I can still count on day 13. Therefore, a person could continue to count, and they could continue to count with a bracha. Okay. Another interesting thing that comes out about counting the Omer is that this is kind of a famous thing, is that a person can only make a bracha, a person can only make the blessing on the mitzvah if they haven't yet done the mitzvah. Once they've done the mitzvah already, so it's then they can't make the bracha after. So let's say a person comes over to you, it's tonight, so tonight is the 18th day of the Omer, and someone says, oh, what day of the Omer is it tonight? And you say, oh, it's the 18th day of the Omer. So if you haven't yet counted the Omer yet, so now you just ran into a problem, because by saying it's the 18th day of the Omer, you might have just fulfilled your obligation of counting the Omer. If you've already done the mitzvah, you can't go ahead and now do the mitzvah again and say a bracha, because you already did the mitzvah. A bracha always has to be said before the mitzvah. So therefore, when a person asks you what day of the Omer it is, if you haven't yet counted, instead of saying tonight's the 18th night, what you should say is last night was the 17th night. There are other ways to get around this problem as well, but that is the simplest problem, the simplest way to get out of it, and that is the recommended thing to do. If you haven't yet counted, someone says what night it is, so you say last night was whatever. This is somewhere where a lot of people get tripped up is on Lag BaOmer. Lag stands for Lam and Gimel, which stands for 33. So a lot of times on Lag BaOmer, even before a person will count, they'll say, oh, tonight's Lag BaOmer. Right? But by saying tonight's Lag BaOmer, that could be counting the Omer. And therefore, especially on Lag BaOmer, I find a lot of people making a mistake then. Person has to be careful. If someone asks you what night of the Omer it is, instead of saying tonight is Lag BaOmer, you should say last night. Well, you can say last night was the 32nd day of the Omer, but even just to say, oh, tonight's Lag BaOmer, person should not say that until they've counted. They've already counted the Omer. Okay. When it comes to counting the Omer, so in the wording of the Omer, so the easy thing to do is just to take a siddur and just to read it in a siddur, then you're for sure covered. As we mentioned before, you have to know exactly what you're saying. You have to know the words you're saying. If you don't understand what you're saying, you likely have not fulfilled your obligation, and a person, like we said, could say it in English. If a person doesn't have a sitter, and you don't know the exact wording, so the truth is the exact wording is not necessarily important, but the following things are. First thing that you have to do is you have to say today is. If you just say 18 or 15 or 22, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. You have to say today is. So you have to say today is, you have to say the number, and you also have to count the days and the weeks, and you have to say it's the 18th day of the Omer. The truth is, if you didn't say of the Omer, you just say today is the 18th day, you would also fulfill your obligation. Ideally, you should say of the Omer, you should mention that you're counting 18 days of the Omer or whatever day you're up to. But if you didn't say of the Omer, you still have fulfilled your obligation. So if a person wants to count, let's say a person's at work, or again, nowadays it's a little easier. You could just look it up. You can look it up on your phone. There's many places to find it. You can sign up for all sorts of WhatsApp groups and messages and emails to make it easier. But if a person doesn't have that, then all a person just has, in any language, a person could just say, today is the 18th day of the Omer, which is 2 weeks and 4 days. And in that way, they will have fulfilled their obligation. There is a dispute when a person is counting in Hebrew, whether they should say it's La Omer or Ba Omer. Hayom Chamisha Sar Yom Shem Shnei Shavuos Var Ba Yomim La Omer Ba Omer. One means for the Omer, one means to the Omer. So according to all opinions, either one you say is going to be okay. If you said La or Ba, either one is going to be okay. Either way, you have fulfilled your obligation. There are certain commentaries who say that one has a slight preference over the other. It seems like most opinions give a slight preference to saying La Omer instead of Ba Omer. If a person has a specific minhag, a specific custom of what they do, then that should be followed. But if not, then I would say ideally to say La Omer. But again, a person could really just say what they want. And finally, one final halacha is that ideally when a person counts, so if they're going to say the bracha and then count, ideally before you say the bracha, you should already know what day it is. So if you're going to say the bracha and then you're going to turn to your friend or turn to someone else and say, oh, which day is it? I point to the sitter asking them which day it is. That's ideally that should not be done. Ideally, when you say the bracha, you should already know, you should look it up before, you should already know what day it is before you say the bracha. All right, we will conclude here. Any questions before we conclude?
Rabbi, I do have one question.
Yeah.
So in terms of the Omer, does one suffice of like, let's say, can you hear someone count and you suffice by just hearing, or you actually have to be the one saying it
Very good question. So, right, normally we apply concept of shomea ka'ona. When we hear something, it's like you say it. When it comes to Omer, because we say the pasuk specifically says v'svartim lachem, each of you should count. Therefore, according to most opinions, you have to count yourself. According to most opinions, you have to count. If a person can't for whatever reason, so that would be second best. They shouldn't say a bracha, but if a person can't, they can hear somebody else say it. But again, especially because you can say it in any language, shouldn't be a problem for most people to say it. But it's not ideal to just hear from somebody else. If you're not able to say the bracha, and this is true, any of the cases where we mentioned that you should count without a bracha, the bracha you could hear from somebody else. Or let's say you don't know how to say the bracha, so the bracha you're always allowed to hear from somebody else. That you could do. In fact, when I say the bracha in shul, I have in mind anyone who's not saying a bracha or can't say a bracha or missed a day, so therefore they can't say a bracha for whatever reason. I have them in mind. The bracha you can say for somebody else, but the actual counting that you should.